They say the soil of Mendoza is soaked in the sweat of generations. But at the dinner table of La Estancia del Sol, it felt as though it were soaked in ice. I sat across from my parents, Eduardo and Sofia, feeling the weight of the Malbec in my glass and the even heavier silence between us. The dining room was a monument to old money mahogany panels, silver heirlooms, and portraits of ancestors who had conquered the desert to plant vines. My brother Mateo was absent, likely squandering another investment in the casinos of Buenos Aires. Yet his shadow loomed over every carving in the room. I was 30, a woman who had built her own architectural firm from nothing. Yet to them, I was merely the independent one, a polite way of saying I was surplus to their requirements. The hook was cast when my father set aside his silver cutlery, not with anger, but with a terrifying, casual indifference. He informed me that the will had been altered. The sprawling vineyards, the ancestral estate in the Yucco Valley, and the secret offshore accounts, everything was destined for Mateo. My mother reached out, her hand cold as a mountain stream, explaining that Mateo had promised to be their protector in their twilight years. To them, my strength was a reason to abandon me. They saw my self-reliance not as a virtue, but as a release from their parental obligations. I wasn't being rewarded for my success. I was being penalized for not being broken. I looked at the vineyard outside, the gold-tinged grapes of the harvest, and realized I was being uprooted from my own history. The voice you selected does not support this language. Please click the upper right corner to switch to another voice. The air in the room became unbreathable as the realization settled. It wasn't about the money. It was about the erasure of my existence from the family's future. But there was a flicker of something in my father's eyes, a glint of fear that didn't match his steady voice. That night, before I left the estate for what I thought would be the last time, I found myself drawn to the library. There, hidden behind a false front of Board's first editions, I discovered a leather-bound ledger. It wasn't just wine sales. It was a record of systemic fraud. A labyrinth of numbers that suggested La Estancia del Sol was a puffer for something far darker than viticulture. Mateo's name appeared next to transfers that defied logic, linked to shell companies in the Cayman Islands. I realized then that they weren't just giving him an inheritance. They were paying a ransom or setting up a fall guy. My independence was actually their safety, they knew. I was too honest to be part of the rot, so they cut me out to keep me away from the evidence. I left without a word, refusing to argue for a place in a burning house. I drove toward the lights of the city, the ledger hidden beneath my seat. A silent detective in my own family tragedy. The drive through the mountain passes felt like an escape from a prison I hadn't known I was in. The voice you selected does not support this language. Please click the upper right corner to switch to another voice. For 5 years I became a ghost. I moved to a small apartment in San Telmo, Buenos Aires, burying myself in work, letting the calls from Mendoza go to voicemail until they eventually stopped altogether. I watched from afar as Mateo's face appeared in the social columns, always at the side of some starlet or at a polo match in Hurlingham, looking every bit the heir to a fortune he was actively dismantling. I heard whispers through the industry that the vintage at the estate was souring, that the workers hadn't been paid, and that Eduardo's health was failing. Every holiday, a generic card would arrive from my mother, filled with hollow wishes and news of Mateo's triumphs. She never asked about my life, my architectural projects, or the fact that I had designed the new museum in Salta. To them, I had ceased to exist the moment I was no longer a potential caretaker. The grief was a slow-moving tide, occasionally pulling me under when I saw a family laughing in a San Telmo cafe. But I armored myself in my solitude. I had built a home that was mine alone, a sanctuary where no one could rewrite my value. I spent my nights studying the ledger, realizing the fraud went deeper than just money. It involved the very land they stood on. Land that had been seized through forged deeds 40 years ago. The voice you selected does not support this language. Please click the upper right corner to switch to another voice. The peace shattered on a humid evening when the doorbell rang with a persistence that suggested desperation. I opened it to find two strangers wearing my parents' faces. Sophia looked withered, her designer clothes hanging off a frame made of anxiety, while Eduardo stood behind her, his eyes darting around the hallway like a cornered animal. They didn't ask to come in, they pushed their way past, bringing the smell of dust and old secrets into my clean life. The story spilled out in a torrent of bitterness. Mateo had disappeared. He hadn't just spent the inheritance. He had used the estate as collateral for debts to people who didn't take kindly to delays. Men linked to the shadowy figures in my ledger. He had sold the lake house in Patagonia, emptied the savings, and fled to Brazil with his latest mistress, leaving them with nothing but a mountain of litigation and a notice of eviction. They looked at me with a terrifying expectation, as if the 5 years of silence had never happened. They spoke of family duty and unconditional love, words they had long ago stripped of meaning when it came to me. They wanted me to use my savings, my life, to buy back the sins of the son they had chosen over me. As they spoke, I realized the depth of the detective work I still had to do. My father mentioned a specific creditor, a name I recognized from the hidden Ligera man known for cleaning fortunes through the wine trade. The truth clicked into place with sickening clarity. My parents hadn't been Mateo's victims. They had been his accomplices until he turned on them. Or rather, my mother had been the architect. She hadn't come to me for shelter. She had come because she suspected I still had the ledger, the only leverage she had left against the men now hunting her. My mother began to weep, lamenting how Mateo had always been their focus, how they had sacrificed me to ensure his loyalty, only for him to betray them. I felt no pity, only a cold, crystalline clarity. I asked them why they thought I would help. My father had the audacity to claim that since I was the strong one, it was my burden to carry them. They were looking for a caretaker, a safety net they could exploit while they mourned the golden son, who had truly destroyed them. I realized Sophia was still playing the game, trying to find where I kept my documents, while Eduardo sat broken in the corner. The voice you selected does not support this language. Please click the upper right corner to switch to another voice. I didn't scream, and I didn't throw them out into the street, not immediately. I waited until they were asleep in my guest room. Then I spent the night finalizing the sale of my firm and my apartment. I had been planning a move to a remote part of Patagonia for months, and their arrival only accelerated the clock. By dawn, I had packed my essentials and the incriminating ledger. I left a single envelope on the kitchen table. Inside was not money, but a copy of the ledger's first page and the contact information for a high-profile criminal attorney. I moved to a cabin near El Chalten, where the granite peaks of Fitz Roy tore at the sky like the claws of a forgotten god. For months, I was just a woman with a notebook and a heavy coat, watching the glaciers calve into the turquoise lakes. I changed my name to Elena, hoping to bury the architect from Mendoza under layers of wool and solitude. But the ledger remained a ticking bomb. I spent my nights deciphering the last few pages, which pointed to a repeated coordinate, marked with the initials SV. It was a ghost. A state near the Cafayate Dunes, a graveyard for the family's true sins. The journey from the icy winds of Patagonia to the high-altitude deserts of Salta was a descent into a different kind of purgatory. I was joined by Mateo, who had found me in Patagonia not to kill me, but because he was being hunted by our mother's cleaners. He was a broken man, revealing that Sophia had used him as a legal shield for decades. We reached the coordinates in the Cafayate Desert, under the cover of a moonless night. There, beneath a concrete slab disguised as a water cistern on a forgotten plot of land, we found the remains of the family's original partner, Sergio Vicario. Sophia hadn't just laundered money. She had built the entire empire on a foundation of murder 40 years ago. She had eliminated the man who held the original deeds to La Estancia del Sol and framed it as a disappearance. The detective in me realized that the inheritance she promised Mateo was a poisoned chalice. She needed a guilty heir to take the fall when these bones were inevitably found by the new owners. She had planned to sacrifice both her children Mateo to the law and me to the shadows. The voice you selected does not support this language. Please click the upper right corner to switch to another voice. We didn't go to the police yet. I knew how deep Sophia's influence ran in the local courts of Mendoza. Instead, we waited for the Fiesta Nacional de la Vendimia, the Great Harvest Festival. My mother was set to receive a Lifetime Achievement Award for her contribution to Argentine heritage. I used my knowledge as an architect to plan our entry into the estate where the gala was held. I knew every secret passage and every flaw in the security system. While the elite sipped Malbec on the terrace, Mateo and I moved through the service tunnels like ghosts. The air was thick with the scent of fermenting grapes and expensive perfume, a nauseating mix of life and decay. I felt a strange sense of power. I was no longer the daughter seeking approval. I was the demolition expert preparing to pull the support beams from my mother's carefully constructed life. We carried the digital files that would link the remains in the desert to the transactions in the ledger. The stage was set for a theatrical execution, the only kind of justice a woman like Sophia would truly feel. The climax occurred under the glittering chandeliers of the main hall. Sophia stood on the stage, a vision of elegance in silk and diamonds, speaking about family values and legacy. I watched from the shadows of the mezzanine, my finger hovering over the upload button on my laptop, when the screens behind her flickered from images of sun-drenched vineyards to the cold, hard data of her crimes and the photos of Sergio Vicario's remains. The silence that fell over the room was more deafening than any explosion. I stepped out onto the balcony, looking down at the woman who had tried to erase me. Her face didn't crumble with regret. It hardened into a mask of pure, crystalline hatred. She knew the game was over. The police, tipped off by a rival in the industry I had contacted, moved in from the wings. In the chaos, my father finally found his voice, refusing to go with her. As they led Sophia away in handcuffs, she didn't look at the husband she had enslaved or the son she had betrayed. She looked only at me, the independent daughter she had underestimated. The voice you selected does not support this language. Please click the upper right corner to switch to another voice. The aftermath was a whirlwind of legal proceedings. La Estancia del Sol was liquidated to pay the reparations to Vicario's surviving kin. Mateo took a plea deal, testifying against the criminal network Sophia had built, finally choosing a path that wasn't paved with her lies. I returned to my cabin in Patagonia, but this time I wasn't running away. I was returning to a home I had earned. The mountains no longer felt like walls. They felt like witnesses to my survival. I spent my days designing small, sustainable structures for the local community, using my skills to build things that were meant to last, not to hide secrets. One evening, a letter arrived from my father. He simply asked for forgiveness, a debt I wasn't sure I was ready to cancel. I burned the letter in the fireplace, watching the smoke rise toward the stars. I had realized that the greatest plot twist in my life wasn't the discovery of the crimes. It was the moment I realized I didn't need their legacy to be whole. I was the architect of my own soul, and the foundation was finally solid. The shadows of the Yucco Valley were behind me, and the clear light of the south was all I needed.